I'm Martin D. Vasquez, and I suppose we're live. Um, Today, I'm here to talk about something very important, and what it is. It's about racism in the United States and how it never ended. Now, a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, well, it's over racism," and we changed a lot. So we overcorrected in 1968 with the civil rights movement, and everything's fine now. That's not the case. Everything isn't fine. What has happened is, over the centuries, people have fought to have a vote in this country, and systematically behind the scenes, the people who are already in control, what they're doing is they're destroying the Constitution and manipulating it with language from um, Alexander Hamilton, for example, and language from the Federalist Papers, so that they say that they're a conservative movement. But that's really, those aren't the facts. The fact is they're trying to preserve something, and what they're trying to preserve is racism and white male control in this country. They don't want to lose power, and they're so afraid to lose power. And the thing is, we're all human beings. We're all citizens here. It's not a threat to our country when other citizens have an opinion. And the problem, it seems, was exacerbated in 1973, when I believe it was 73, when maybe sooner, but when the Heritage Foundation was born. So it's my understanding there were two White House aides who wrote, they were in a coffee shop or something. They wrote down the idea for it. And, the first year of the presidency of Ronald Reagan, it was very similar to the first year of the second term here. And they got, most of their policies, and they bragged about it, and they still brag about it. In the first year of the presidency, they get most of them done. So it's online. It's called Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation's website. And if you start reading it, it's really insane. And it literally has racist language in it, which their main goal relies on, because it relies on ending diversity, equity, and inclusion in that language in government areas and government documents. However, these are words that are defined in a dictionary, and we're always going to have marginalized communities. So what we need are to have words to describe them when people are being marginalized and people are being disenfranchised. So what they're doing is they're censoring words, not just any words. Three of the most important words in our language and in dictionaries: diversity, equity, and inclusion, in order to maintain control as white people, white males specifically. And here's the thing: in 2045, the population of white Americans will fall below 50%. So if there's a coalition between women, people of color, the LGBTQ community, and all other marginalized communities, then we are in control in 2045. But if women today who are marginalized, white women, because they might be white women, but they're still marginalized and disenfranchised because they're women. If we get white women to vote in a fair way, and white women, we want your white women, by the way, white men. We just want you to know that, white racist males. But if they do, then we can take over the majority now. I call it Project 2045, and I'm gonna play it so people can hear it. But it's a refutation of Project 2025, which is it's just a really insane racist agenda. But here's the thing: this is the plan that President Trump is using. So if you go and you read it, or you just listen to what I'm going to play now, you'll see that everything that's happened is because Donald Trump got into office and they threw a big package of 900 pages on his desk and said, "This is the strategy for your whole term," and he's following it, to the T. Even the meteorological, monitoring systems in the ocean that are being removed are in this document. It was written in 2023. It's called Project 2025. But what I'm going to play for you is my take on it. Well, I wrote Project 2020-45, and this is it. So here it goes.
Department of Justice. Project 2025 calls for the complete subordination of the Department of...
Maybe I have to start it over.
26. Preamble. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union...
There it is. I'm going to take this jacket off.
Project 2045. A Mandate for the American Majority. By Martin D. Vasquez. Project 2045. A Mandate for the American Majority. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Published by Medium Output. martindvasquez.substack.com. Martin D. Vasquez, editor and founder. 2026. Preamble. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, submit this declaration of organized democratic intent. We write it in the tradition of those who came before us, who understood that a republic is not a possession to be inherited by the few, but a covenant to be renewed by the many. The Federalist Papers were written as a defense of constitutional government against tyranny, not as a manual for tyranny's exercise. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist number 78 that the judiciary has neither force nor will, but only judgment. Judgment, not agenda. Judgment, not partisanship. Judgment, not the engineered advantage of one group over all others. When courts abandon judgment in favor of will, when they rewrite the meaning of our founding documents to serve a faction, they do not interpret the Constitution. They betray it. The framers who wrote those papers also wrote the Bill of Rights. They did so because they understood that power, left unchecked, becomes tyranny. What we are witnessing today is the systematic dismantling of the safeguards they built, carried out by a movement that wraps itself in the language of those same framers, while violating everything those framers stood against. To use the words of our founders to reframe diversity, equity, and inclusion as threats to the Republic is not constitutional scholarship. It is a forced misreading in service of forced tyranny. It is the appropriation of the language of liberty to extinguish liberty for others, and it will not stand. Project 2045 is our answer. It is named for the year when non-Hispanic white Americans will fall below 50% of the United States population, not as a threat, not as a crisis, but as a fact. A demographic fact that a democratic government must be prepared to serve. Project 2045 is a long-range coalition strategy built on three foundational objectives pursued through the most powerful instrument a democracy possesses: the vote. Who we are? We are the preservationists of the Republic. We are not here to change the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States. We are here to preserve them, to defend them against those who have hijacked their language while dismantling their meaning, and to restore their promise to every person they were always meant to protect. We are the marginalized communities who have been disenfranchised by the corrupt tyranny of oligarchs who never truly surrendered control of this government to the freedom of the vote. That surrender was promised. It was written into law, and it was resisted at every turn. Women were denied the ballot for nearly a century and a half after this republic was founded. Black Americans were denied the full exercise of the franchise for a century after the Civil War formally ended. Indigenous peoples were not granted citizenship until 1924 and faced voting suppression for decades beyond that. The vote was not given freely. It was taken through protest, through sacrifice, through suffering, and through the kind of organized political courage that this coalition intends to honor and continue. The oligarchs who resisted then are not gone. They have simply reorganized. They have wrapped their resistance to democratic equality in constitutional language while gutting constitutional protections. They have built institutions, funded ideological blueprints, and placed their chosen judges on courts of lifetime appointment. Project 2025 is not a new idea. It is the oldest idea in American politics, that the republic belongs to a select group of people, and that the expansion of its promises to others is a threat rather than a fulfillment. We reject that idea. We always have. We are Black Americans who built this country under conditions of forced labor and who have been excluded from its wealth, its ballot, and its institutions at every stage of its history, not by accident, but by design. We are Latino Americans, the fastest growing demographic in this nation, whose communities are being targeted by mass enforcement operations designed to intimidate, displace, and silence us before our full political power can be realized. We are LGBTQ+ Americans. We are not an anomaly. We are not a political invention. We are not a phase. We are born, we live, we work, we love, we serve, and we vote. No executive order changes that reality. We will continue to be born. The language that describes our lives and our identities is not propaganda. It is vocabulary, and it is constitutionally protected. We are indigenous peoples who have survived the longest and most systematic campaign of dispossession in the history of this continent, and whose right to vote remains under active suppression today. We are Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, a diverse and growing community whose political power deserves genuine engagement, not demographic assumption. We are all women. We are all women because all women remain marginalized. This country has not reached an equitable solution for the rights of women. It has not achieved gender equity in pay, in representation, in bodily autonomy, or in the basic recognition that women's lives and women's choices belong to women. The suffragists who marched for the right to vote did so over the explicit objection of their husbands, their churches, and their government. They were arrested. They were force-fed in prison. They were told their place was not in the public square. They went anyway because they understood that their dignity as full citizens could not be subordinated to anyone else's comfort or control. That fight is not finished. We call on all women to join this coalition. Black women, Latino women, Indigenous women, Asian American women, LGBTQ+ women, and white women, because the marginalization of women does not stop at the color line. White women live in a country where their reproductive autonomy has been stripped by a court that was manipulated into existence by the same movement behind Project 2025. White women live in a country where they earn less than men for the same work, where they remain underrepresented in Congress, in corporate leadership, and in the judiciary. White women live in a country that still has not ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. The ballot is secret. It always has been. What a woman marks in that booth belongs to no one but her. The suffragists exercised that private courage when the stakes were existential. The stakes are existential again. We are working-class Americans of every background who have been told, for generations, that the people most threatening to our livelihoods are other working people who look different from us, rather than the oligarchs who have controlled the terms of our labor, our housing, our healthcare, and our political representation since the founding. We are the American majority. We are the preservationists of the Republic, and in 2026, we intend to govern like it. The three-part agenda. Everything in this document flows from three foundational objectives. They are the answer to Project 2025's three foundational sins: the capture of government, the destruction of rights, and the corruption of justice. Part 1. The power of the united majority vote. We will unify the American majority into a voting coalition that elects a government reflecting the full diversity of this nation. We will diversify Congress, the executive branch, and every elected body in America. We will protect and expand voting rights against every form of suppression. Part 2. Defend the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. We will halt and reverse the systematic dismantling of constitutional protections. We will restore the language of equity to federal policy and defend it as a First Amendment right. We will protect every marginalized community from state-sponsored erasure. Part 3. Reform the Supreme Court and pass the Donald Trump Reversal Act. We will expand the Supreme Court to restore its independence and unwind the damage of the Roberts era. We will pass comprehensive legislation to repeal, nullify, and reverse every executive order, agency rule, and administrative action taken in furtherance of Project 2025 doctrine. Section 1. Returning the Republic to its people. Project 2025's first section is titled, Taking the Reins of Government. Its purpose is to concentrate executive power in the hands of an ideologically vetted few, purge the federal civil service of anyone not personally loyal to a conservative president, and transform the machinery of democratic governance into an instrument of factional control. It proposes eliminating civil service protections, implementing Schedule F to allow mass firing.
So I'm not going to keep interrupting. But the whole goal is to eventually have a conservative white president who is the right candidate for the Heritage Foundation. So we could have, a lot of fair presidents in between, and we can even have unwilling Republican presidents who want to, commit their own crimes, I guess. But in the end, all they have to do is every once in a while, implement these policies, and it extends their control or their ability to not just maintain or retain control, but to take back control of the country, extremely as they have now. And it's a cycle, and it's a long-term plan. But I'll continue. I'll let it continue.
And placing every corner of the executive branch under direct presidential command. It is, in the language of the framers, exactly the kind of consolidated tyranny the Constitution was designed to prevent. Project 2045's first section answers with the opposite vision. A government returned to its people, staffed by professionals who serve the public rather than a party, led by officials who reflect the diversity of the nation they govern, and accountable to the Constitution rather than to any single faction. Chapter 1. The White House Office. Project 2025 envisions the White House office as the ideological command center of a movement government, staffed exclusively by personnel vetted for loyalty.
So one final thing, and you guys can come back in and out here, but the thing is it's going to start off by, mentioning Project 2025 and then our response with Project 2045. So that'll be the pattern throughout the whole thing, just so it's clear for you guys.
Conservative doctrine, and empowered to impose that doctrine on every federal agency. It calls for the White House to function as a political weapon rather than an administrative institution. Project 2045 answers with a White House office that is a steward of the Constitution, not a fortress of faction. The White House staff must reflect the diversity of the American people in race, gender, background, and lived experience. Senior positions must be subject to meaningful transparency requirements. The White House Office of Public Engagement must be restored and expanded with dedicated liaisons to Black, Latino, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, Asian American, disability, and women's communities. The practice of ideological loyalty tests for federal employment is unconstitutional on its face and must be prohibited by statute. The three-part agenda requires a White House that uses its convening power to advance voting rights, defend constitutional protections, and coordinate the legislative effort to pass the Donald Trump Reversal Act. Chapter 2. The Executive Office of the President. Project 2025, authored in large part by Russ Vought, calls for the Office of Management and Budget to be transformed into a political enforcement mechanism, using the budget process to defund agencies and programs that do not align with conservative ideology. It calls for the president to assert unchecked impoundment authority, refusing to spend funds appropriated by Congress, a power the Supreme Court has already ruled unconstitutional. Project 2045 answers with an executive office restored to its constitutional function, the faithful execution of laws passed by Congress and signed into law. The OMB must be prohibited from using the budget process as an ideological weapon. Impoundment of congressionally appropriated funds must be recognized for what it is, an unconstitutional seizure of legislative power by the executive. The Council of Economic Advisors must include economists representing the full range of American economic experience, including those with expertise in racial wealth gaps, gender pay equity, indigenous economic sovereignty, and working class economic mobility. The three-part agenda requires an executive office committed to budgeting for equity, not against it. Chapter 3, Central Personnel Agencies. Project 2025's most structurally dangerous proposal is Schedule F, a reclassification scheme that would strip civil service protections from tens of thousands of federal workers and allow a president to fire and replace them with ideological loyalists. It is the mechanism by which Project 2025 intends to transform the permanent government into a partisan one. Project 2045 answers with the strongest possible defense and expansion of civil service protections. The federal workforce is not a political army. It is a professional institution built over more than a century to serve the public regardless of which party holds power. Schedule F must be permanently prohibited by statute. Federal employees who were fired for political reasons under the current administration must be reinstated with back pay. Whistleblower protections must be strengthened, and the federal workforce must actively reflect the diversity of America with binding recruitment, retention, and promotion equity requirements across all agencies. The three-part agenda requires a civil service that is independent, professional, diverse, and constitutionally protected. Section 2. A defense that defends everyone. Project 2025's second section covers national defense, homeland security, foreign policy, the intelligence community, and international broadcasting. Its vision of defense is one that prioritizes military dominance, border militarization, and the projection of ideological power abroad, while systematically stripping civil liberties at home in the name of security. It treats immigrant communities as threats, LGBTQ+ service members as problems, and international cooperation as weakness. Project 2045's second section answers with a defense posture that actually defends everyone, that treats the constitutional rights of American residents as worth protecting, that builds alliances rather than burning them, that welcomes the contributions of every American regardless of background to the defense of the nation, and that understands that a country cannot be secure abroad when its own people are not safe at home. Chapter 4, Department of Defense. Project 2025 calls for the purging of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs from the military, the removal of transgender service members, the elimination of what it calls social engineering from military culture, and the restoration of a narrowly defined warrior ethos that excludes anyone who does not fit its ideological model of a soldier. Project 2045 answers with a Department of Defense that draws its strength from the full depth of American diversity. Every study of military effectiveness demonstrates that diverse units, diverse leadership, and inclusive cultures produce better outcomes. Transgender Americans have served with distinction in every branch of the military. Their service is not a social experiment. It is a fact of American military history. Their reinstatement, with full restoration of rank, benefits, and back pay, is both a moral and a strategic imperative. DI programs in the military are not political impositions. They are readiness tools. A military that cannot retain its best people because of discrimination is a weaker military. The three-part agenda requires a Defense Department that defends the rights of those who defend the nation. Chapter 5, Department of Homeland Security. Project 2025 calls for the restructuring of DHS around a singular mission of mass deportation and border militarization. It envisions ICE as an unchecked enforcement army, FEMA as a program to be dismantled, and the entire department as an instrument of demographic control rather than genuine security. Project 2045 answers with a DHS that understands security and civil rights as complementary, not competing values. The Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights of every person on American soil, citizen and non-citizen alike, must be enforced. Warrantless mass enforcement operations that rely on racial profiling are unconstitutional and must be prohibited. ICE must be subject to independent oversight with full transparency on use of force, detention conditions, and deportation procedures. Private detention contractors whose profit motive creates incentives for prolonged detention must be phased out and replaced with publicly accountable facilities. FEMA must be strengthened, not dismantled. Climate-related disasters disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. A DHS that serves the American majority invests in disaster preparedness and response for the communities most at risk. Chapter 6, Department of State. Project 2025 envisions American foreign policy as an extension of domestic culture war, withdrawing from multilateral institutions, abandoning climate commitments, and using American diplomatic power to export conservative social policy rather than democratic values. Project 2045 answers with a State Department that leads with the full promise of American democracy. America's credibility abroad depends on the integrity of its democracy at home. The United States must recommit to multilateral institutions, international human rights frameworks, and climate agreements. Our diplomatic corps must reflect the diversity of the nation it represents and the world it engages. Chapter 7: The Intelligence Community. Project 2025 calls for the politicization of the intelligence community, placing it under tighter presidential control and purging analysts whose assessments do not align with administration preferences. This is not a reform. It is the destruction of the one institution whose value depends entirely on its independence from political pressure. Project 2045 answers with an intelligence community whose independence is protected by statute, whose leadership cannot be removed for producing politically inconvenient assessments, and whose oversight by Congress is strengthened rather than weakened. Domestic surveillance authorities must be strictly limited to protect the civil liberties of American residents. Chapter 8: U.S. Agency for Global Media and Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Project 2025 calls for the elimination of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the transformation of American international broadcasting agencies into overt propaganda instruments serving administration ideology. Project 2045 answers with robust, independent public media as a democratic necessity. Public broadcasting serves rural communities, low-income communities, and communities of color. Its independence from government control is what gives it credibility. Defunding it eliminates a public information resource that serves the people. Project 2025 has decided do not matter. Chapter 9: Agency for International Development. Project 2025 calls for gutting USAID and redirecting what remains toward narrowly defined American commercial interests, eliminating programs focused on reproductive health, gender equity, and democratic institution building in developing nations. Project 2045 answers with a USAID restored to its mission of genuine development assistance. Reproductive health is healthcare, gender equity is development, democratic institutions are security. USAID must be fully funded, staffed with diverse expertise, and empowered to pursue development goals that reflect the values of the American majority. Section 3: The Welfare of the Many, Not the Few. Project 2025's third section covers agriculture, education, energy, health and human services, housing, the interior, justice, labor, transportation, and veterans affairs. It is the section most directly targeting the daily lives of ordinary Americans, and it is the section most nakedly designed to benefit the wealthy and powerful at the expense of everyone else. Project 2045's third section answers chapter by chapter with a vision of government that actually serves the welfare of the many. Chapter 10: Department of Agriculture. Project 2025 calls for rolling back food assistance programs, eliminating conservation requirements, weakening school nutrition standards, and prioritizing the interests of large agricultural corporations over small farmers, rural communities, and food-insecure families. Project 2045 answers with an agriculture policy centered on food security as a human right. SNAP, WIC, and school nutrition programs must be expanded, not cut. Black farmers, who were systematically denied USDA loans and assistance for generations, are owed both reparative investment and structural reform. Indigenous food sovereignty must be respected and supported. The USDA must be a partner to small and mid-sized farmers of every background, not a servant of agribusiness monopolies. Chapter 11: Department of Education. Project 2025 calls for the complete elimination of the Department of Education, the defunding of public schools through voucher programs, the banning of curricula that address race, gender, or systemic inequality honestly, and the removal of all federal civil rights protections from the nation.
So that specifically, what it helps us to realize is that this has been an agenda by the Republican Party for years, but why? And the thing is, these agendas that have been built since 1973 are because of the fear of the year 2045, when the white majority falls under 50%. And the whole term white majority is a farce. It's being white isn't even a race. It's just a word. But the goal is to create a coalition of voters for fair voting. And we have to look at all the marginalized communities and we really just have to tell each other, hey, look, quit being stupid. These people don't care about you. They're the oligarch. Well, they're trying to build an oligarchy, but they are the people who are in charge. They're the billionaires. They're the white conservative male Republicans. There may be a few minorities that are tokens mixed in or are billionaires as well, but they don't really care about us. And their goal is to let us starve. They're going to let us starve to death because they really don't care.
Schools. Project 2045 answers with a Department of Education that is fully funded, fully empowered, and fully committed to every child in America. Federal education funding must be increased with equity as its organizing principle. Curricula must be accurate, inclusive, and honest about American history in all its complexity. Title IX protections must be restored and expanded to cover gender identity. The rights of LGBTQ+ students to exist safely in their schools are not negotiable. Chapter 12, Department of Energy. Project 2025 calls for dismantling clean energy programs, withdrawing from climate commitments, expanding fossil fuel extraction on public lands, and eliminating the environmental justice offices that direct resources to communities most harmed by pollution. Project 2045 answers with an energy policy that treats the climate crisis as the existential threat it is, and environmental justice as a constitutional imperative. Communities of color and low-income communities bear a disproportionate burden of environmental pollution. Clean energy investment must be accelerated. Fossil fuel subsidies must be redirected to renewable energy development. The environmental justice offices that Project 2025 targets for elimination must be expanded. Chapter 13, Environmental Protection Agency. Project 2025 calls for gutting the EPA, eliminating its ability to regulate greenhouse gases, rolling back clean air and clean water protections, and returning environmental regulation to states regardless of whether those states have the capacity or the will to protect their residents. Project 2045 answers with an EPA restored to its full regulatory authority. Clean air and clean water are prerequisites for human life. The rollback of environmental protections always falls hardest on low-income communities, communities of color, rural communities, and children. The EPA must be strengthened, and its civil rights enforcement function must be fully activated. Chapter 14, Department of Health and Human Services. Project 2025 calls for dismantling the Affordable Care Act, gutting Medicaid, eliminating reproductive health programs, banning gender-affirming care, removing LGBTQ+ protections from HHS programs, and reorienting the entire department around a narrow religious definition of family. Project 2045 answers with a vision of health and human services grounded in the principle that healthcare is a human right. The Affordable Care Act must be expanded.
So the idea of family by the Heritage Foundation, what that means is white family. That's their racist term for saying family, the white people who are in charge.
Universal cover.
The problem is we're never going to be able to prove that these are coded words or, because they're so vague. But what we can do is what this is all about. And we have two very powerful things. We have a voice and we have a vote. And the thing is, other countries have realized how valuable the vote is in the United States. That's why they're trying to infiltrate our internet and our apps, because they want to influence us, because they know that our vote changes the world. It's so important, but I'll let it continue. It's almost over.
Medicaid must be protected and expanded. Reproductive health care, including abortion, is health care. Gender-affirming care is evidence-based medical care supported by every major medical association in the United States. LGBTQ+ Americans must have full and equal access to every HHS program. Chapter 15, Department of Housing and Urban Development. Project 2025 calls for eliminating fair housing enforcement, dismantling programs that address residential segregation, ending housing assistance programs, and removing the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Project 2045 answers with a HUD that treats the legacy of redlining, discriminatory lending, and racially exclusionary zoning as the ongoing civil rights crisis it remains. Fair housing enforcement must be strengthened and fully funded. The affirmatively furthering fair housing rule must be restored and expanded. Housing assistance programs must be expanded to address the affordable housing crisis, displacing low-income families and families of color from their communities. Chapter 16, Department of the Interior. Project 2025 calls for opening public lands to commercial extraction, weakening the Endangered Species Act, rolling back protections for national monuments, and overriding tribal sovereignty over indigenous lands in favor of resource extraction. Project 2045 answers with a Department of the Interior that honors the federal government's treaty obligations to indigenous nations as the supreme law of the land. Tribal sovereignty is a legal right established by treaty, affirmed by statute, and protected by the Constitution. Public lands belong to all Americans, including future Americans. The Endangered Species Act must be strengthened. National monuments must be protected. Chapter 17, Department of Justice. Project 2025 calls for the complete subordination of the Department of Justice to presidential will, the purging of career attorneys who have pursued cases against political allies, the redirection of DOJ resources away from civil rights enforcement, and the transformation of the FBI into a loyalty instrument of the executive. Project 2045 answers with a DOJ whose independence is protected by statute and whose Civil Rights Division is fully staffed, funded, and empowered to enforce every civil rights law on the books. The voting rights section must be restored to its historic mission. The pattern or practice authority to investigate and reform abusive police departments must be fully exercised. The three-part agenda requires a Department of Justice that belongs to the Constitution, not to any president. Chapter 18, Department of Labor. Project 2025 calls for weakening union organizing rights, rolling back worker safety regulations, eliminating overtime protections, gutting the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and reorienting labor policy around employer interests. Project 2045 answers with a Department of Labor that unambiguously takes the side of workers. The right to organize is a constitutional right of association. The EEOC must be fully funded and empowered to enforce anti-discrimination law across every protected category, including sexual orientation and gender identity. Worker safety regulations exist because workers die without them. The Department of Labor must be what its name says it is, the Department of the people who do the work. Chapter 19, Department of Transportation. Project 2025 calls for deregulating transportation safety standards, defunding public transit, and prioritizing infrastructure that serves suburban and exurban populations over the urban and rural communities most dependent on public transportation. Project 2045 answers with a transportation policy that serves the full geography and diversity of America. Public transit is not a luxury. For millions of low-income Americans, for elderly Americans, for Americans with disabilities, and for urban residents, public transit is access to employment, healthcare, education, and civic life. It must be fully funded and expanded. Chapter 20, Department of Veterans Affairs. Project 2025 calls for privatizing VA healthcare, shifting veterans into private insurance markets less equipped to handle the complex health needs of combat veterans. Project 2045 answers with an unequivocal commitment to every veteran who has served this country. The VA must be fully funded, fully staffed, and fully empowered to provide comprehensive health care, mental health services, housing assistance, and disability support. Black veterans, Latino veterans, Indigenous veterans, women veterans, and LGBTQ+ veterans have faced systemic discrimination in access to VA services that must be identified and eliminated. Section 4, an economy built for the American majority. Project 2025's fourth section covers commerce, treasury, trade, the Federal Reserve, the Small Business Administration, and financial regulatory agencies. Its economic vision is the consolidation of wealth at the top, tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, deregulation of financial markets, elimination of consumer protections, and the subordination of every economic institution to the interests of the investor class. Project 2045's fourth section answers with an economy whose growth is shared, whose rules protect workers and consumers as much as corporations, and whose institutions serve the American majority rather than the American oligarchy. Chapter 21, Department of Commerce. Project 2025 calls for dismantling NOAA, eliminating economic development programs that serve underserved communities, and reorienting the Commerce Department entirely around the interests of large corporations. Project 2045 answers with a Commerce Department that serves the full American economy. NOAA must be protected and expanded. Its climate science, weather forecasting, and ocean monitoring functions are essential public infrastructure. Economic development programs targeting underserved communities are investments in the productive capacity of the American economy. The Commerce Department must address the racial wealth gap, the gender wealth gap, and the geographic wealth gap as unrealized economic potential. Chapter 22, Department of the Treasury. Project 2025 calls for massive tax cuts for corporations and wealthy individuals, the elimination of progressive taxation as a principle, and the use of Treasury policy to benefit the investor class at the expense of working Americans. Project 2045 answers with a Treasury Department committed to tax policy that is genuinely progressive, that asks the most of those who have benefited most from the American economy, and that funds the public investments the American majority needs. The racial wealth gap is the accumulated result of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, discriminatory lending, and the systematic exclusion of Black, Latino, and Indigenous Americans from wealth-building opportunities. Tax and investment policy must actively work to close that gap. Chapter 23, Export-Import Bank. Project 2025 calls for abolishing the Export-Import Bank, framing it as corporate welfare while ignoring that its elimination would cede export financing to state-backed competitors, harming American workers and businesses. Project 2045 answers with an Export-Import Bank reform to ensure that its benefits reach small and mid-sized businesses, businesses owned by women and people of color, and businesses in underserved communities. Used equitably, it can support the diversification of American exports and the building of businesses in communities excluded from international trade opportunities. Chapter 24, Federal Reserve. Project 2025 calls for placing the Federal Reserve under greater political control, undermining the independence that has been the foundation of American monetary credibility for more than a century. Project 2045 answers with a Federal Reserve whose independence is protected and whose dual mandate, maximum employment and price stability, is honored in full. The Fed must also be required to analyze and report on the distributional consequences of its monetary policy decisions, including their effects on racial and gender wealth gaps. The Federal Reserve Board must include representation from labor, from communities of color, and from working-class economic perspectives. Chapter 25, Small Business Administration. Project 2025 calls for gutting the SBA, reducing its loan programs, and eliminating targeted assistance programs that help women, minority-owned, and veteran-owned small businesses access capital. Project 2045 answers with an SBA fully committed to the democratization of entrepreneurship. Women-owned, Black-owned, Latino-owned, Indigenous-owned, and LGBTQ+ owned businesses face documented barriers to capital access that are not the product of merit, but of discrimination. The SBA's targeted programs exist to correct those market failures. They must be expanded, not eliminated. Chapter 26, Trade. Project 2025 calls for an aggressive unilateral trade posture that prioritizes confrontation over cooperation and that uses trade policy primarily as a vehicle for nationalist political messaging rather than genuine economic strategy. Project 2045 answers with a trade policy that serves American workers first, that includes enforceable labor and environmental standards in every trade agreement, and that builds multilateral coalitions rather than burning them. Trade agreements that do not include strong protections for workers' rights to organize are not free trade. They are agreements that pit American workers against workers in countries with no labor protections, to the benefit of corporations that profit from that race to the bottom. Section 5, regulatory agencies that serve the public, not the powerful. Project 2025's fifth section covers the independent regulatory agencies: the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Election Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission. Project 2025's goal is to capture these agencies entirely, transforming regulators designed to protect the public from corporate and political power into instruments of that power. Project 2045's fifth section answers with a vision of independent regulatory agencies that are genuinely independent, genuinely public serving, and genuinely accountable to the people rather than to the industries they regulate. Chapter 27, Securities and Exchange Commission and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Project 2025 calls for gutting the SEC's enforcement capacity, weakening disclosure requirements, and eliminating the CFPB, the single federal agency specifically designed to protect consumers from predatory financial practices. Project 2045 answers with a CFPB that is fully funded, fully independent, and fully empowered to pursue every form of financial predation. The communities most victimized by predatory financial practices are low-income communities and communities of color. Eliminating the CFPB is not deregulation. It is the removal of the only cop on and broken for most of this nation's history, the promise that all people are created equal, that they are endowed with unalienable rights, and that the purpose of government is to secure those rights for everyone, not just for the demographic group currently holding power. Project 2025 is a plan to make sure that promise is never fully kept. Project 2045 is a plan to make sure it is. Our three-part agenda is not a wish list.
Okay, I'm going to stop it, and that was the conclusion anyway. But the point is that for thousands of years, through the Tower of Babel, these ancient stories, these stories are about how governments have taken advantage of the population, and the whole concept of the shepherd and the sheep is what's going on now. And so what they've done is they told people you're white, and they've given them carte blanche, the white card. So you show the white card and you have carte blanche. You can do whatever you want. And what that was, it was a ruse, because they took these groups of people, and that's perfect. Well, we'll say that they're white because they have lighter skin, or they're good looking. We'll tell them they're good looking, and as people are getting all these benefits from it, they forget their history. So 3 generations slip by, and they're like, listen, we'll control all your cultural history. We'll put it in a library. We'll save it. And you guys are, the shepherds of society. So those people fall for it. And they're actually being victimized because they're losing their history. But I mean, you could ask a lot of white people, they may not even know their own history, but they know they're white. White it's not a culture, it's not an ethnicity, a nationality, nor is it a race. It's a fallacy. So the white shepherd fallacy is what's going on, because you can go to people now and they're continuing to vote for corporate oligarchy. So they're like, no, I'm going to vote Republican because, it doesn't benefit them at all. But, they're going to say it does. And the reason why is because all they have left is racism. That's it. They don't have an identity, a culture. They don't even know who they are. But the point is we want to end the term white people. And we want to start calling people who are white. We're not going to do them like they did us. We're going to help them research their past and find their history. But right now, we're going to call them others, perhaps others, and they're others until we help them find their history. And they may never, they may be others forever. But the whole point is that white, sexist, racist males are advocating for white supremacy. So they're like, we're the ones in charge. We're still in charge. And, we have to trick everybody else into believing that this is what's going on. They're not necessarily the most intelligent people. They're the sneakiest people, though. They're really snakes. And all these biblical stories. The thing is, there was only so many pages uh, in the Bible for the scribes to fill all the ancient stories into. So what they did is they combined these ancient tales into one story. They seem maybe similar, so we have these stories in like religious scripture, and they may have originally not even been religious. They may be lessons of political manipulation, and they are, and a lot of them are. Specifically, the Tower of Babel. And they don't want you to read these things. They don't want you to read how the people who are in power, the kings, manipulate, the people. They don't want you to know that. And well, maybe one day in a live, I'll talk about the Tower of Babel and how it's significant with everything that's happening, because they erase your language. They get you to, they unify civilization with one language. They erase the other languages, and you have one language. And they put your history in the library, and they destroy the library. And they give every one temple to worship their own God at. They give you freedom, and then you get a little too lippy. You get a little uppity, and then they destroy the temple, and that's what they're doing with us. So they're not necessarily going to kill us all, but they're doing it. They're putting people on these dangerous drugs. I'm not saying pharmaceutical drugs. They're allowing those things to happen. They're all these disruptions in our lives that make it difficult for us to move forward or to gain. These are designed, and some of them are paradigms that exist by accident, and then they perpetuate them. And it's an important. Oh, yeah, Tool's awesome. They're a great band, and they're very spiritual. And Daddy Carey is unbelievable. But I was in live, and they're like favorite Tool song, and I put a couple down, and Daddy Carey actually liked it. My responses, so that was kind of cool. But the thing is that our that's that maybe that's what we are, our tool, in for them to accomplish whatever they're accomplishing. Once they're reaching this point, they don't want to lose it. They don't want to lose control of their great lives. We're not living great lives. You could be middle class. You're not living a great life. You're surviving. And that's another thing. It's like this affordability term is bullshit. I don't know who's perpetuating it, but let's not use that term. Let's call it survival. That's what it really fucking is. It's not, oh, we can't quite afford things. Bullshit. This is fucking survival, man. And the whole thing is there's an ancient Chinese myth, and it talks about how peaches are, how they ripen, the peaches of wisdom of the gods ripen every 6,000 years. 3,000, that's a long story. Well, it's a short. But anyway, the point is it's really being descriptive of how society breaks every 3,000, 6,000, 9,000 years, because people catch on to the bullshit. And eventually, the people who are in charge, they lose control of everything. So back to the point is the Heritage Foundation. They're those people. And, the thing is the civilized, wise people in history didn't win. The idiot quick killers won. The one who could stab somebody in the neck and not even think twice about it. The guy's like, well, wait a minute, maybe, we're going to have to, and they stab him in the neck, and then they win. That's who's in control. Those are the people who are in control. The people who think very quickly, but they don't really think about things. They don't have a wise, method of considering things. Though that's who's going to win, in civilization and control. But there's something called evolution. And evolution isn't natural selection. Natural selection is a small part of evolution. And evolution is transcendence. And we're reaching, and like the story of the peaches, we're reaching an evolutionary point in history. it's not just a renaissance, it's a revolution in spirituality and intellectual achievement. And we're at this point, and these people are confused why it's not working as well. Why they're not able to be as abusive. And that's it's a cycle of civilization. But it's also the universe getting to the point where, like, these people are starting to be disruptive, and maybe it's just in this and it's shaking off the assholes, and we're recalibrating the frequency of time together. And that's our goal, is to recalibrate the frequency of time. And we're peaceful people, and we're the wise people, and we're the wise ones, and we're not the quick killers. So it's going to take us a little time. And when I said earlier, they don't care if we die. The thing is that everything's out there. So unfortunately for them, they give us the ability to communicate with each other, which is a mistake on their part. But they're letting us slowly die off. That's all they need to maintain control and the populace and the population, and control everything. But the Heritage Foundation wrote this doctrine, and it uses 3 words: diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it wants to exclude them from the dictionary. That's racist. I mean, that's the definition. It defines racism. So the thing is what we have to do is start documenting these people who are trying to apply these. The people who are voting for this to be, the presidential, agenda. These people, we have to start documenting them, and we really have to stop voting for white people. Except maybe white women, but white males, we have to stop voting for them, and we're not, with our vote, we're going to control the situation, because we really can't trust them. We really cannot trust white politics. They had, honestly, they've had 20,000 years, well, 10,000 years to fix this racism, and they didn't even try. All right, guys, I'm out of here. Have a great day.